Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel. I'm Public Affairs Officer at Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. I'm joined here today by Tamara Flanagan from New Europeans and Zahira Patel from Fragomen. And we're going to be talking about how charities can support the people that they work with to access the EU settlement scheme. The reason we were keen to do this webinar was to raise awareness and understanding about the role that charities can play in particularly those charities that aren't specialists in migration issues, in ensuring that people they work with can access settled status, particularly given that the people that you work with may face particular barriers in accessing or even knowing about the scheme. So I will hand over to Tamara and Zahira in a moment, but first just a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphone should be muted during the webinar, but there is an opportunity to ask questions. So you can do this by typing into the Q&A box, which it should be on your screen. You can type a question at any time during the webinar, but we'll answer them at the end. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can get through, but we're aiming to finish by 5:15 at the latest. And if there's any questions that we don't have time to answer, there will be links to other sources of information, and we can share contact details as well. Just to say that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to view on our website afterwards in the next week or so. And please bear with us if you have any technical problems in the meantime. So I will hand over now to Tamara to kick off.
Hello there, thank you for joining us for this webinar. New Europeans is an organisation that works both with immigration advisors and also with the voluntary sector. And it dawned on us that life is changing for Europeans living in the UK. And at the moment, the immigration sector is really being helpful in that regard, and the Home Office also. But this will probably not be a long-term interest, whereas the voluntary sector knows a lot of the kind of people who are going to be in the categories described as vulnerable and unlikely to apply for their status. And so it would be a really good idea for the voluntary sector to know about the challenges these Europeans will be facing, and not to advise them because you've got plenty of other things to do, but to be able to signpost them to people that could help. So the EU settlement scheme has been designed by the Home Office for EU nationals members. Sorry, I'm supposed to for EU nationals, EEA nationals and their family members to maintain their right to stay in the UK. You've probably all heard about Brexit, but you might not have heard that without accepting the new status, EU citizens could not. Without that status, EU nationals become undocumented migrants, and this of course exposes them to all kind of risk, not least not being able to access healthcare, benefits, the right to rent, the right to open bank accounts and similar. So because we are convinced that the voluntary sector know a lot of individuals and have beneficiaries, volunteers, staff who are of European origin, who may be exercising their right to live in the UK, we thought it would be good if the voluntary sector knew how to help those groups. And for that reason, we've engaged in this webinar with Zahira, who's going to tell you some of the important detail about the scheme.
Hello everyone, my name is Zahira Patel. I'm an immigration lawyer, so I have the very boring job of going through the very technical details about the EU settlement scheme. I'll be taking you through some of the key issues with the EU settlement scheme, especially how it relates to vulnerable groups. But before I do so, I wanted to really start with the key dates, because that will really be the most important thing to bear in mind for the reasons that Tamara has mentioned. There has been a lot of uncertainty over the past few years, but we find ourselves now with a bit more certainty. What we expect to happen next is that the UK will leave the European Union on the 31st of January this year, so this Friday at 11 p.m. But we're expecting to leave with a deal, what's called the withdrawal agreement, which is in the process of being approved now. So nothing should change immediately on Friday, assuming this deal goes through. Instead, what will happen is that there will be a transition period until the 31st of December 2020. And that's really important because it means that the European nationals that you support have a bit longer in order to actually apply for their status. And it also means that European nationals who enter the UK until the 31st of December 2020, so until the end of this transition period, can still apply to the EU settlement scheme. The deadline to apply is the 30th of June 2021, assuming that this withdrawal agreement goes through. So this is really the key date. A lot of people who aren't aware that they need to apply, it's really important that they know that they will need to apply by the 30th of June 2021. And on the 1st of January 2021, a new immigration system will take place. But for people who have been in the UK by the 31st of December 2020, they will still be able to take advantage of the EU settlement scheme. So that's where we are in terms of dates and what happens next, and that's really the key. I won't go through the EU settlement scheme process in too much detail because it can get very technical, but here's a little flow chart you can see on the screen of what the process entails. The key things I wanted to mention are things like if the applicant doesn't have, the first document there is a EU passport. So this is a biometric passport. But something to note is that if the European national or their family member, if it's a family member, don't have that document or don't have access to an app or an Android phone, there are places that you can go to get them help, and they will be linked later on. So that's normally one of the big issues for people who are anxious about applying, is that they will think they don't have the right technical equipment. The other thing is that what happens normally if everyone has access to a passport and a mobile phone to do an identity check is that once you go to the online form, you're normally asked to submit your national insurance number so that HMRC can do this kind of automated check to try and pull up your tax records and find out if you've been in the UK long enough to get some kind of status. And the reason that I flag that is a lot of vulnerable applicants in particular aren't aware that this part of the process can be flexible. They can, if HMRC can't find their records for any reason, or if they don't have a national insurance number, there are places that can help them to get the right evidence that they can upload themselves. So it's really important that they don't just accept whatever HMRC automated checks say if they know that they've been in the UK a bit longer than the system might say. And at the end of that process, once they've kind of completed a very short online form or uploaded additional documents, they'll either get something called pre-settled status or settled status, depending on how long they've been in the UK. So I'll talk a bit more about what those mean a bit later on. This slide outlines who should apply to the scheme. I'm not going to go through all of these points because most people are aware that European nationals who are already in the UK will need to apply, but European nationals and the family members who are resident in the UK by the end of the transition period, so that's 31st of December 2020, will still be able to apply. And they can actually have, with applying, not in the same application with them, but they can sponsor their non-EU family members to apply. And again, a lot of people aren't aware who in their family can apply. So I've just outlined the list of people there. But the key thing I wanted to flag in this part is there are a lot of particularly vulnerable migrants who think that they already have a document that's issued saying that they can live here and that therefore they don't need to apply. So a lot of people who have a registration certificate, a family permit or something like that assume that that will protect them. This isn't the case. They actually still need to apply to the scheme. And to make it a bit more confusing, there's another status called indefinite leave to enter or remain. And if you have that status, you don't need to apply. So what's really important is just to let the people that you support know that even if they have a document, showing their right to remain in the UK now, it's worth getting that document checked out by people who can help so that they know if they need to apply or not. And then I've just listed some other technical points about Irish nationals and British nationals, which I won't go into, but I'm happy to answer questions about. The type of status you can get under the EU settlement scheme depends on how long you've been in the UK. If you've been in the UK for 5 years, and that's continuously, so in the UK for 6 months, in every 12-month period for 5 years, you get something called settled status, which is the same as indefinite leave to remain. And that means that you can remain in the UK without time restrictions. You don't have to make any further applications. You can lose the status if you leave the UK, but you have to have left the UK for 5 consecutive years before you lose that status. So that's a bit more generous than a lot of other different types of indefinite leave to remain. There are some exceptions for absences. So if you have a vulnerable applicant who you know or supporting who has been absent for longer than 6 months in any 12-month period for something like a pregnancy or childbirth, then again, it's worth signposting them to get some advice about it, because there are exceptions allowed for those kinds of situations. If an applicant hasn't been in the UK for 5 years, but they have been in the UK before the end of the transition period, so that's 31st of December 2020, then what they will get instead is something called pre-settled status, and that's a limited right to remain in the UK for 5 years. The idea is that once they then reach 5 years, they can then apply for settled status. So that's the indefinite leave to remain. And it's important to flag that once they reach the 5 years, they will actually need to make that further application for settled status, because again, a lot of applicants who have pre-settled status might not be aware that they would have to make that further application. And there are also absence requirements for this pre-settled status and ways that you can use it if you've been out of the UK for 2 consecutive years. So if they are planning long absences from the UK, again, it's worth signposting them to get some advice about how it might impact their right to remain. The next slide goes into some detail just about the types of documents that most applicants will need when they apply. Again, I'm not going to go through all of those details, but I put them there because what I want to highlight is that the Home Office have said that they should be taking a flexible approach to these documents. And the fact that these documents are kind of expected makes a lot of applicants, particularly vulnerable applicants, very anxious if they don't have those documents. So things like a national insurance number, which I've listed for both EU nationals and non-EU family members, that's a question that gets asked on the form. And a lot of people are really, really worried about that because they assume it means you have to be working or you have to have the national insurance number. The key thing is that you know, they should be flexible about this. So if someone doesn't have a national insurance number, they should be able to provide some other kind of evidence to show that they've been in the UK. And where charities come into that is a lot of the time, people who are particularly vulnerable or who are being helped by charities. So for example, people who are homeless and who are being helped by a homelessness service to try and find accommodation, or people who are experiencing mental health difficulties, for example, or people who are fleeing from domestic violence. Oftentimes the charity might approach the charity to ask you if you can provide them with a letter, not providing legal advice, but a letter saying, you know, I confirm that I have helped this person apply for housing in the UK. I confirm that this person is currently homeless, and therefore, you know, it should have some flexibility with regards to their evidence. Or I confirm I helped this person on this date with this appointment. And what that does is it allows the applicant to say that they have been in the UK, and this charity engagement is one of the ways that they can prove that. Similarly, I've listed here proof of residence and proof of evidence for family members of how they're related to their EU sponsor. And I just want to flag that because things like birth certificates and marriage certificates might also be quite difficult for vulnerable applicants to get. So this particularly impacts people who, for example, have left violent partners and they can't access that person's passport, for example, or cohabitation evidence. Again, in that situation, if you're a charity who supports domestic violence survivors, then you may be asked to perhaps write a letter or work with the applicant, perhaps try and find some records that they can use. So it's really important to think about your role in that way, and that might be one way to provide support. So another thing that many applicants are worried about is what if they're refused? What happens then? Now, the key thing is that the Home Office has said they want to grant these applications. They are not looking to refuse people except for the most serious criminal convictions, which may lead to refusal. So people who have serious criminal convictions, you should be signposting them to get legal advice so that they know the risks when they apply and what they can do afterwards. But people with minor convictions, it shouldn't be refused. And so again, this might put some people off from applying, but it's worth signposting them to someone who can provide advice and perhaps assess their criminal conviction to say if they think it will be serious enough or not. But although most people shouldn't be refused, what tends to happen instead is that the Home Office may locate someone's tax records and find an incomplete record. So they might find, for someone who's been living in the UK for 5 years, they might only be able to find 3 years or 2 years of records. And if that happens, then again, you should signpost them to someone who can help them get more residence documents, because they don't need to accept the lower pre-settled status. They can upload their own evidence to try and get settled status instead, and they can apply again if they've got pre-settled status or settled status. So it's worth just bearing that in mind, and knowing that perhaps you can signpost people in these situations if they're concerned about these particular issues. And we really wanted to flag this point because this is one of the key issues with the scheme, particularly for vulnerable applicants. It's people who have lived in the UK for 5 years, but their tax records are not up to date. For example, if they haven't been working or if they haven't been claiming benefits, if, for example, they've been carers or stay-at-home parents, or perhaps they have a cash-in-hand job. What happens a lot in these cases is that applicants are accepting the HMRC automated check, which tells them they've been in the UK for less time than they actually have, and they don't need to do that. If they are entitled to settled status, then they should and can apply for that. So it's worth just letting people know that perhaps they can get some support with what other documents they can submit if there are any issues with the HMRC or tax checks. And that's really important because settled status gives you certain advantages that pre-settled status doesn't. For example, the length of time that you can leave the UK and the fact that you don't need to make another application once you've already got settled status. And that's all the legal details. If you have any questions about that, I know that it was a basic run through. I'll answer those at the end, but for now, I'll hand back over to Tamara, who'll speak about vulnerable groups accessing the service in particular.
Aware of these changes, because in fact it's not just vulnerable groups in the way that we might imagine them, but also people, for instance, who have been here for time, people who may think they have the right kind of residence, people who believe they're ineligible because they may have minor criminal convictions, they may have been previously rejected for some form of status, and lots of individuals who have been here a very long time cannot believe that they have to apply for a health service and similar, think that they are safe in Britain now. So that's why people that you may work with or people that may be coming into your centre should be aware that there's something they need to get checked. And Zahira said it before, and I'll say it again, even if they think they're home safe, they should get it checked. If they aren't applying for settled status, they should get it checked. So why might some people not? Because, as Zahira said, if they are survivors of domestic violence, if they are people who've been subject to, if they have other things on their mind because they're living in poverty, or if they're not in stable housing. These are the kinds of reasons. So we did some work at New Europeans about what kinds of reasons did you think would stop. And the largest group actually said accessibility, and that was particularly people who aren't looking at webinars, people who aren't seeing it on their Facebook, people who don't have a mobile phone that does all those things, so that access is very important. There are some communities which are closed off from the questions around settled status. There are some communities, Europeans, who may have third sector, who may have come from another country, and their particular communities haven't talked a lot about this. And this is something that we have seen recently. There may be language problems, but not quite as you would think, not because people don't speak good English. If you need to work in England, you tend to speak good English, but because you want to be certain about things like legal terms. And so we have done quite a lot of work with translating information, all of which you'll see on the next slide are available on ours and other websites. People not being aware, people feeling very anxious. There's a huge amount of anxiety amongst European citizens at this time about what they will be experiencing after Friday. And people who have other reasons for not being aware may have health issues, particularly mental health issues, or indeed capacity issues. So these are the sorts of groups that may not find it easy. And in order to help with that, we have worked with the Mayor's Office, who have a brilliant website, which is EU Londoners, where there is information about settled status in 27 languages, Somali and Farsi and other languages, not just. We've also on our own website and that of the Air Centre got leaflets translated to get settled status, about what not to worry about, and there are videos in other languages that have been produced so that people can actually look at information in their own language and understand what next steps they need to take. And the digital support, which is the assisted digital service coming from the Home Office, is particularly important to point people towards, because they are the service that can determine whether or not someone needs additional help, whether or not someone could benefit from a home visit, whether or not someone very exceptionally could fill out a paper form, because this is an online status that we're talking about. So that's particularly a number to look at again when you look at the webinar after today. So the question of why people might have difficulty demonstrating that they've been living in the UK may not seem obvious, but not have bank accounts, or maybe don't have access to the information for the last 5 years. If you bank online, you don't automatically see the statements from. They may be cash in hand workers, they may be stay-at-home parents. Sahira has gone through some of these unpaid carers, young people or training, or people who arrived just before the cut-off date in December 2020. So what's the government doing to help these vulnerable individuals? Well, the Home Office, you may have read about that, committed some funding to support vulnerable groups, and these are the groups who were awarded that. You can find on the Gov website a list of these groups and their contact. We have specifically identified some groups at the end of the webinar that are likely to be useful for you, given the Lloyds Foundation grantees kinds of areas of work. For the longer term, though, just to point this out, we are thinking that at the moment, solicitors, law centres, people with money from the Home Office are likely to be working with European citizens, vulnerable and not vulnerable. But they do that by exception, and they do it when there are issues. They don't do it in the long term. And one of the things the voluntary sector alongside people long term. And what we are noticing in the work we do, advising, Sahira particularly, and other organisations we work with, is that there are issues coming up which are going to have repercussions in the longer term. Things like aftercare. So if somebody has taken pre-settled status, they need to apply for the full status in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. They may have moved home, they may have changed phone, they may have changed email. This could be an issue down the line. Some people have used other people's email addresses in a group situation. Someone will say, I'll lend you my phone, this is my email, get your registration information, and they may not track them afterwards. People's names and addresses may change. This digital status, which I might add New Europeans is campaigning along with others for there to be a physical proof of identity, is going to be difficult for people to access if they're not particularly digitally literate. If they want to get a job, and they have to give the would-be employer a link to the digital status, and the employer can verify their status, all of which, of course, doesn't come in until 2021. But that's why it's important to think about the longer term. Those with pre-settled status may struggle to access benefits. This is definitely true. And we are not convinced that the hostile environment that people experience who are migrants in the UK at the moment will be going anywhere, rather that it might be extended to Europeans who haven't got the right status. We know there's a rise in hate crime, and in fact, people are talking about Friday possibly being a time for people to be worried about how they're addressed by those who are happy to be changing status or happy to be leaving. And we also know that there's a lot of pressure on public services, your own services included. You're bound to be underfunded, overworked, and trying to do more than you thought you would have to. And here's another thing. But we're not asking you to do anything. We're saying, here are people that can help. Signpost your folk to these people. And that, for the voluntary sector to do that, would be enormously helpful in this situation. So talk about the scheme, communicate it to your networks, signpost people to various the projects that will receive support from them. Also, these services that we're listing here, the Air Centre, the Here for Good, Fragomen themselves, the Rights of Women are a very active group, Eastern European Advice Centre in King Street in Hammersmith, IMO, the India American Refugee and these are all people working in London particularly, although they're also working outside of London, and certainly the ones so I think that's about it from me.
So we'll take a look at the questions now.
Okay, so just please bear with us while we read through the questions. Oh, I'm so sorry. Someone has said that the speaker's microphone keeps breaking off. Really sorry we didn't see that before. Hopefully you can hear us now. For who would you recommend we would signpost people to advice, for advice? I think Tamara has just listed some of the organisations that we have on the slide. Some of them are still up, and you will be given a copy of these slides later on, and I think it will be available on the website afterwards, so you should be able to access them. And you also have our email addresses, so these are on the slides, so you will be able to hopefully contact us. Someone has asked if an applicant doesn't have a passport but an EU national ID card, can they still apply? Yes, so you can apply with an EU ID card. Again, it's worth having that checked though. If someone really can't get a passport, then it's best to contact the Resolution Centre or one of the organisations just to double check that that's okay. But generally, yes, you can apply with an EU identity card. The reason I say get it checked is because a lot of people might think they have an EU identity card, but they have another document instead. I think that's all the questions so far, unless I've missed any. Yep, I think. Thank you, everyone. If you have any other questions, just let us know.
Thank you very much for joining us. We will be sharing this webinar on our website, and you can go to the links that are provided in the slides as well, and with any kind of follow-up questions. Thank you very much to Tamara and Zahira for a really informative session. We will be sending around an email with a link to the webinar, and as well as asking for some feedback about how you found it as well. So thank you for joining us.